Marines were people too. A little hardier and a little bit more adaptable than the average sapient, perhaps, but still as mortal as anyone else, and as such just as prone to the same minor inconveniences as the next person. Jason was no exception, and his inconvenience of the day had chosen to manifest itself in the form of a throbbing finger. A finger that was throbbing specifically because it had spent the last few hours sliding across a datapad screen. Touchscreens were wonderfully intuitive things, but there was no denying that they suffered some tiny drawbacks when compared to more aged technology. Which was why, as he reclined back in the Whisker's engineering bay, he found himself debating as to whether or not he should introduce the idea of a mouse to the Imperium. He could do it. It wouldn't even be hard. The last few months with Kernathu had seen him introduced to the CAD software attached to the military fabricators back on Gurathu. Given how far away the planet was from the rest of the Imperium, the machines saw more use than they might otherwise, as people chose to fabricate parts and materials they might see more cheaply imported otherwise, but it would be simple enough to book in some printing time when they were back on world. Hell, now that he was thinking about it, the mini 3D printer aboard the Whisker would probably be sufficient for the task, and he doubted TC would have any issue with him dropping into the ship's minuscule store of raw materials for his project. Especially given that she was still trying to buy her way back into his good books over what was being referred to as the mail incident around the ship. The only issue he could really see was that she would still be obligated to at least ask why he needed those resources, for the paperwork if nothing else. At which point he'd have to explain what a mouse was, and why he wanted it. Which was essentially because his fingers got sore from sliding across screens for long periods of time. And he didn't know if his masculine pride could suffer the look of, "Really?" she would undoubtedly give him. Or if, God forbid, Rocket got wind of it. "Fuck it," he murmured. "I'll just say I'm more used to mice." "What's a mice?" Jason damn near jumped out of his skin. "Holy shit!" he shouted, as he whirled around to find Yarrow standing over him. Which was less of an immediate relief than one might think, given that Yarrow was for all intents and purposes an alien werewolf, with all the intimidation factor implied by that statement. Never mind that he'd porked said terrifying alien werewolf not more than a few hours ago. Scary was scary. Desperately calming his racing heart, he glanced up at the Rakiri. Yarrow, for her part, seemed completely unfazed by his surprised exclamation, her features completely blank, just as always. Or at least that was what he would have said a few months ago. Nowadays he knew to look for the subtle cues. The slight tensing in the thighs, the twitching in the right ear, the subtle swish of her tail. Yarrow was laughing at him. Sure, it wasn't an outright belly laugh that would have involved her making the slight chuffing sound she did, but it was still a display of humour. Finally getting his breathing under control, he frowned. "I'm putting a bell on you." "I would not decline such a gift," the alien said, tilting up her nose slightly. "You are welcome to do so." Jason sighed, giving up on that idea. If the Rakiri was willing to accede so easily, he doubted a bell would help. She'd still sneak up on him, only to then gloat about the fact that she could do so with a bell on her. Or at least she'd do the Yarrow equivalent of gloating, which to be honest wasn't all that dissimilar from Yarrow laughing. It just had a bit more tail swishing to it. "So, what had you so focused that it was even easier than normal to sneak up on you?" she asked, craning to look at his down datapad. "Missing colonists?" Jason resisted the urge to sigh as he scooped up the device. Just a bit of research. Yarrow cocked her head. "Why?" He shrugged. "I've just heard a few comments on the subject recently and I got interested." "So you decided to look into it of your own volition?" Yarrow smiled in that peculiar manner of hers as she slumped onto the canteen seat he had been occupying just moments ago. "How heroic." Jason shook his head in dismissal. "Hardly. I've just realized that I'm probably the most valuable target on the planet from a valuable species standpoint," he thought. "And if there are abductions going on, I'm in danger." "Just a passing interest of mine," he obfuscated, feeling a little flustered by the look his occasional lover was giving him. There's not much else for me to do right now. Is the mech finished? Yarrow asked. He shook his head. No, just stalled until Konothu can source some parts. Parts that very pointedly couldn't be made in the base's fabricator, not due to a lack of capability on the machine's part, but copyright laws, which meant that if Konothu was going to get the parts they needed, she'd have to buy them directly from the sellers, which took time. So I'm passing the time by following up on something that's been bothering me since Kelly mentioned it. Perhaps if he hadn't known Yarrow for as long as he had, he might have missed it. As it was, he definitely did notice a slight hunching of her posture at the mention of the other Rakira's name. You disagree? He asked. Or is that little twitch because of an issue with Kelu? The alien woman froze even further at the realization that her antipathy had been noticed. I have no strong feelings towards Kelu one way or another, she said finally, slumping slightly. I will, however, state that our leader has suffered greatly at the hands of raiders, and thus may see dangers where none may actually exist. Jason couldn't hide his surprise. People are disappearing, though, he said, pointing to his device. Yarrow nodded as she looked at the datapad. Certainly, but it is a small number relative to the population of Kurathu. I will admit that it is perhaps a number slightly higher than average for a modern society, but Kurathu is a dangerous world. As you might recall, we ourselves always became missing persons. The Gontreur is not a wasteful beast. It would have left precious little of our bodies behind had it managed to overcome us. Jason couldn't help but shudder a little at the thought as he remembered the massive beast getting the drop on both of them. Almost unbidden, he glanced towards his quarters on the Whisker, where his tooth necklace was hanging inside his locker. Ignorant of his momentary reminder of their mutual brush with death, Yarrow continued. Many Urakiri may have also chosen to simply disconnect themselves from known information networks. What, so they just drop off the grid? He thought. You get many people doing that? He asked, seeking confirmation. Yarrow frowned a little. One does not usually choose a life on the utmost outskirts of space because they are greatly enamored with the Imperium. Many of those who settle on worlds like Gorathu do so because of the distance and the relative freedom it provides. He couldn't help but notice the faint hint of distaste that ran across the wolf woman's features as she said that last part. You disagree? He asked. I have no say on how others choose to live their lives, so long as they do so within the bounds of the law. She hesitated slightly. I will, however, say that the fact that a portion of my people still refuses to engage with the Imperium, despite the time that has passed since our independence and now, is frustrating. The Imperium is going nowhere. Obstinance aids no one. Jason was a little surprised. He'd never really taken Yarrow for particularly pro-Imperium before. Then again, she is part of the Imperium military, he thought. And he sincerely doubted anything as convoluted as had happened to him had occurred to her. No, Yarrow had in all likelihood joined entirely of her own volition. Sounds a bit more personal than just general distaste, he pointed out. Yarrow's frown deepened before a hint of humour came back into her features. It is a not uncommon topic of discussion when my family meets for Hurtle feasts. He had no idea what Hurtle was, but he was going to assume it was like Thanksgiving, or Christmas. Either way, it was kind of comforting to know that awkward politically charged arguments over the dinner table were apparently a universal truth. It almost made him glad his dad had taken off for parts unknown before he'd reached an age where he might have started voicing his own opinions. So you don't think these abductions are happening? He asked finally, returning to the topic at hand. Yarrow chuffed, the Rakiri equivalent of a shrug. I struggle to see how. That is our purpose out in the void, is it not? To watch for raiders and their ilk? To ensure the events that you describe do not come to pass? She glanced at her wrist computer. I must report to my duty station. Jason nodded, waving at her as she left. He would also admit to a little envy. Konothu had little need for his services at the minute, so he was on standby, which is why he'd been out here in the first place. Of course, now Yarrow had come and ruined his momentary diversion by quite reasonably pointing out that there was no way a ship full of slaves could realistically still be raiding Gurathu. Picket ships like the Whisker were covering all approaches to the planet. A ship couldn't just sneak past. Unless they were bribing one of the other ships, he thought, his mind immediately leaping to the most obvious solution to that problem. So, have we learnt our lesson? Jason aimed a glint eye at the ship's doctor as she applied bruise cream to his shoulder, which the woman just smiled at, completely unfazed by his unimpressed expression. Yes, he finally allowed, deflating slightly. I've learned to never let Assis know that I'm not busy. Good, Cirilla laughed. Jason was less sanguine about the situation, wincing as the woman's fingers moved over another bruise. One of many. He hadn't even meant anything by it. It had just been an offhand comment when Assis stepped into the cafeteria to grab something from the food fabricators, which did not actually fabricate food so much as arrange, cook, and prepare a number of pre-frozen meals, much to his disappointment. Apparently the Whisker's head marine had taken his words as a challenge because there were few things the military detested more than idleness, which is why he had spent the last 3 hours engaged in close-quarter combat drills. The Shorvanti woman hadn't even had the good grace to be his only participant. No. To compensate for the massive difference in stamina levels between them, she spent those 3 hours having his opponent rotate between Scales, Yarrow, Rocket, once, and herself. As the Whisker's doctor spun in her seat to look at her datapad, Jason found himself peering around at the cool white panels of the room he was in. This was actually the first time he'd been inside the Whisker's medical bay, which was a bit of a surprise to be honest. One would assume that he'd have been bustled in here the moment he arrived on board for a preliminary medical, the moment he came aboard. That hadn't happened though, and he'd never given it much thought. It wasn't his problem after all. He'd had a medical check before departing from the Crucible though. Maybe that was all that was needed. White's a pretty universal medical colour, isn't it? He stated, surprising himself as he realised he'd said the words out loud. If the Whisker's medical officer was in any way surprised by the seemingly random statement, it didn't show as she continued tapping away at the terminal attached to her desk. I suppose it is, she said, without turning around. Probably because medical environments need to be clean, and it's very easy to see dirt on the white surface. Jason nodded absently. That made sense. Silence reigned as Cirilla continued to tap away at her device. It wasn't necessarily awkward, but he'd been stretched to call it friendly either. If he had to compare it to anything, he'd say it was like sitting in a doctor's office. A somewhat obvious comparison, given he was in a medical bay, but he supposed that was what felt strange to him. It was exactly like being in a doctor's office. Cirilla was treating him just like anyone else, her demeanour cool and professional. Sure, she'd cracked a few little jokes to break the ice, but they'd just been icebreakers with no ulterior motive beyond good bedside manner. My God, he thought, as he came to a realization. Does this interaction feel odd to me because Cirilla's not attracted to me? She's impressed by you, you know. Jason nearly jumped at the unexpected statement from the quiet doctor. At some point during his musing, she turned back around to look at him. Assis, Cirilla clarified, seeing his mystified look. I don't see why she would be, Jason scoffed, given that I'm in here getting ointment applied after being beaten black and blue. Black and blue? Cirilla mused. What a curious phrase. She turned her attention back to him. And I would note that the fact that you're in here after being beaten black and blue by half the crew is the reason why I think she's impressed. She cocked her head slightly, eyes roaming over him contemplatively. Given that he was currently shirtless, he'd normally assume the Shorvanti was shamelessly ogling some free eye candy. As it was, her eyes were almost entirely analytical. If she didn't think much of you, she wouldn't be pushing you so hard, the woman reasoned. I'm pretty sure that's mostly because I showed up here half-trained, he deflected. Assis is doing what she can with what she's got in the vain hope I won't accidentally blow my own foot off during the next boarding operation. Cirilla smiled. You're certainly welcome to believe that. I think you might change your mind if you heard how our dear Marine Chief raves about you to our captain. She was most impressed with your performance in the last anti-grav exercise. The woman's smile turned decidedly plastic at that last statement, no doubt remembering the nausea brought about by the ship's constantly changing gravity. Jason just chuckled. He wasn't a soldier. Even after everything he'd been through, he still struggled to think of himself as one. He was just a guy in a strange set of circumstances. Sure she isn't just raving about me because I'm doing well for a guy? He joked. Of course his chuckles abated almost instantly, as the ship's doctor fixed him with a look. It wasn't angry, nor was it cold. It was disappointed. The kind of disappointment you might receive from a particularly well-liked aunt, which was an odd comparison for Jason to make, given that he'd never had an aunt. Hell, he'd barely had a mother. Aziz might joke around in just about every other area of her life, Cirilla explained, slowly. But I can assure you, when it comes to matters relating to her work, she's completely serious. If she says you have talent, you have talent. Jason nodded. If only to get her to stop looking at him like that. Which, mercifully, she did. Now, if it was TC raving about you, Cirilla continued, features morphing into a teasing smile, I might be less inclined to believe said words were entirely factual, what with the girl being positively smitten with you. Jason had a feeling he wasn't supposed to have heard or know that, which is probably why Cirilla had said it. Right, can I go? He asked awkwardly, looking longingly towards the exit. Of course, Cirilla's smile only widened. I finished applying the ointment, so you could have left 5 minutes ago. Jason practically bolted from the room.